Fear.
Fear.
Fear. Fear. Fear.
Fear. I've often wondered how the mind reacts to this primeval emotion. Do we all start our lives scared of the things that hide in the dark? But then later, curiosity overpowers this instinct to the point where you live at its boundary, not knowing what it actually is, but in a constant need to learn it to survive. Fear was the silence of the calm forest, the depth of the night sky, the luminance of the full moon, the monsters hiding under my bed. My reality of fear has always been warped and distorted and reshaped by the kind of things that I watched while growing up. The horror was exhilarating on my old TV screen, for in my little mind, everything I watched was real. It felt real, so it had to be real, or such was my consumed mind. But as I began to get older, I started questioning the shape of this fear. It was simply understandable that this felt real to me, and it registered in my brain as such, but there were more questions that I wanted answered. Things that arose not from the perceptual reality of live action, but rather questions of fear within a different medium entirely. Why was I afraid of this hand-drawn scene from one of my favorite cartoons? Why did I feel uneasy to give this anime a try? There must have been something that I didn't want to feel, for I was perhaps afraid. When I was young, I was afraid of the horror of realism, but as I get older, I'm beginning to realize the absolute horror of animation. The fear of the animated is something that I once thought was impossible. In my childhood brain, the animated was correlated to cartoons, and something that was cartoonish could never invoke fear within me. Or so I thought. But that notion didn't last that long. All it took was a scene from an episode of SWAT Cats that changed my reality. Perhaps on another day, this wouldn't have scared me, but there was something uneasy about this character that I vividly recall, and the first time I felt fear of animation at all was perhaps this. It all stems from this one harrowing piece of visual. I still feel a bit odd while watching this scene and looking out through my bedroom window at night. It is strange that in my late 20s I still feel like a 5-year-old, but perhaps that is the nature of animated horror. The horror of animation is hard to put into words. Well, fear as an emotion is perhaps boundless to begin with, but to feel the fear of animation, I feel like it goes beyond that. I mean, it's not that you can't feel the ever so tangible realism of a cinematic horror film. By definition, it is the fear of the reality around us. The haunted house in The Conjuring is perhaps the house we have all come across while growing up. The urban myths of strange noises that arise from such a house, the tale of disappearances in and around its premises, the way the streetlights even flicker in the nights. These are all realistic features surrounding a real-life tangible story. The fear might as well be real, for even if it is to an extent, you can live it in reality. But as far as I can imagine, animation has no bounds whatsoever. And here, the boundless nature of fear even threatens the extremities of our imagination. And this is by no means a way to explain why the horror of the animated triumphs over the realism of live action. I have no intention to venture into such a strange debate, for fear, even within all our primitive emotions, is perhaps the most instinctive. So what I simply want to do with this exercise is to express the type of horror that is often overlooked. I want to delve into the complexities of animated horror. Don't you feel it too? Look at those whirlpools, the looming mountains around us. I hate that gloomy sea. The sound. I hate that sound.
That's it. This town is driving me insane, winding me up. It's making me spiral.
These vague lines from Junji Ito's Uzumaki, fabled for swallowing the mind of its reader, got life in the most fascinating style of animation. Even if it was only for a single episode, the black and white drawings from the manga panels moved. Every subtle line, every stroke of ink, crafted carefully to induce that exact same feeling. The feeling that I've known from reading the works of Junji Ito. But now, out of the paper, onto a screen, the infinite fear of the unknown. The fear of the unknown is perhaps the grand umbrella term that envelops fear as a whole. On a tier list, it holds the most uncertain variables, things that are beyond the comprehension of the ordinary human. Here, there's not much to understand, for even if you try, you only fall deeper into its presence. But on that scale, the shape of fear does have a name. Coined after the great horror writer H.P. Lovecraft, Lovecraftian horror, or quite simply the all-encompassing cosmic horror, is where we begin our exploration of animated horror. The horror of the cosmic is notoriously difficult to portray in all its mysticism. Invoking this particular fear involves, in a way, a kind of absence than presence. You show too much and you jump into another genre of horror, which is probably why it's far less common to stumble upon this nature of horror on your television, which is also why an animated version of it would be all the more an anomaly. Now, I fully understand why the reception to this anime wasn't exactly what I thought it would be. It was well and truly a bummer how the animation just fell off a cliff as the story progressed. But I think there's something deeper to learn about the nature of horror from the failure of this adaptation. But still, the animation from the first episode is perhaps why I felt the need to talk about Uzumaki in the first place. The unnerving terror of Junji Ito's works are crafted in black and white, and as the saying goes, it is better left alone on those panels of manga forever, and I think there's a good reason why people say that. For one, the cosmic scale of something like Uzumaki is simply far-fetched of a concept for any kind of screenplay, and for another, adding color to his style of art, it simply dilutes the significance of the subject matter completely. So how do you capture the visceral nature of this fear in animation? Well, you do this. And I think some of the animation from the first episode is perhaps the closest thing that you'll ever get to a perfect adaptation of Junji Ito. And for the most part, the horror is conveyed exactly how it was meant to be. The subtle movements of spirals in the sky, the hand-drawn lines of wind that sweeps across the screen, the erratic movement of whirlpools in the stream. What you'd call a perfect adaptation. The art carrying the brunt of the story being told. The animation simply gives life to it. But the freedom of animation is a strange thing. Something so elegant and subtle can turn into something outlandish in a matter of seconds. This was one of my grotesquely favorite panels from the whole manga. The morbid curiosity makes you turn the page to welcome your eyes to the side of this gore. But in animation, you can take it to the absolute extreme. And they left nothing to the imagination here. The spinning eyeballs, animated with all the repulsive feelings that you can possibly muster, along with the lines and the nuance of hand-drawn art. This is horror of a rare kind. A horror that can only exist between the boundary of the real and the artistic. A type of horror that can only survive in the world of animation. But yet, once you are in the zone and start looking to trouble your curious mind, the cosmic fear in animation starts popping up in random places. And one such story that puts the scale into perspective is an episode from Love, Death and Robots called Beyond the Aquila Rift, a story based on the book by the science fiction writer Alastair Reynolds. Diluted to fit the pacing of the anthology, the story slams into your mind relatively quickly. Here, unlike the hand-drawn horror of Uzumaki, the animation is much more polished and digital, making it closer in shape to realistic space horror like the Alien franchise. The animation is pretty darn good. It showcases stunning pieces of visual that you can put on a portfolio. But animation has come a long way in such a short time that can create memorable stories without just being pretty things. It can endure the gravity of even some of the most difficult subgenres in fiction. Although unexpected, everything seems to go almost too well for our spacefarers. They find themselves in a giant space station within the company of friendly humans after having woken up from their cryosleep. But the fear only weighs in once the protagonist realizes the extent of the mistake.
This is Uzumaki Station in Shadar Sector.
Shadar Sector! That's light years of our course.
There's no way a routing error got us that far!
The spaceship, completely lost in the depths of space, somewhere in an unknown galaxy, far away from their original destination. Distance is what sparks the cosmic nature of this horror. And that flame burns in the background, a small gnawing feeling that slowly starts to consume. The fear that begins as an abstraction now takes the shape of the woman who was supposed to be a familiar face. Now we are on the brink, and now we are waiting. A stroke of luck, which turned to a mystery, awaits the final revelation. It was all a sham, the illusion too perfect to be real, but the truth unbearable for the body and the mind. What exactly was this place? A graveyard for the lost? An abandoned superstructure? And then a spider-like entity reveals its identity to be the same woman, the familiar face. And this is where fear completes the true shape of cosmic horror. This creature is simply unfathomable for the human mind, even with all that technology that is portrayed to be stunningly futuristic, built by an advanced version of us. The sheer scale of the cosmos provides a case for entities that are even beyond the limits of human imagination. And this exercise in the cosmic intangible would tell you that fear of the unknown has no medium, whether it be the real or the animated. The fear of the unknown needs no medium. However, when you scale down this horror to encapsulate something that is still beyond the grasp of the human mind, but something that is still at the fringe of comprehension, we arrive at what is called the edge of the unknown. Fear has a looming quality here. It presents itself as an elusive entity, always at the tip of our fingers, but never quite fully grabbable. And sometimes I feel like this type of horror is right up the alley of animation, for abstraction is the key in portraying this edge of the unknown. And one such series that I really enjoyed watching recently, which plays into this horror, is a cartoon called Over the Garden Wall. A fairy tale-like story set in the midst of a mysterious forest. A forest that slowly but surely invokes this unknown. Greg and Wirt are two kids who get lost in this uncanny environment, and the more they try to find ways of escaping this strange world, the more they get stuck under its spell. It almost feels like the forest is alive, and the mention of the beast at every odd interaction only adds to this looming fear. But the nature of this horror is really subtle. The fact that the boys are lost and they hardly possess a map to have any bearing of where they are, it takes away any semblance of power that characters have in a story. They are well and truly at the mercy of their environment, a forest that everyone believes is patrolled by a mysterious entity, an entity that captures the ones who lose their way in the woods. The forest is not specifically a place that is hard to comprehend. It has trees and an undergrowth, decaying leaves and branches, creatures that you can read about in a biology book, all adding up to create an ecosystem that is truly alive. But yet, there is something about a forest that makes you think. Something much more deeper within the psyche that makes you wonder if you should be there at all. The unknown catches you fairly quickly in such places. And the motif of the story portrays these boys to always be at the edge of this unknown, an unknown that follows them quite literally, an unknown they walk into metaphorically. But once they finally meet the unknown, there is no telling what it actually is. Speculations would suggest the beast to be the forest itself, or perhaps something else entirely. But the kids endure this final boss, and in a regular fairy tale fashion, they both return safely back to their home, making you think if this was a children's cartoon all along. It's kind of amazing how the nonchalant style, the simple dialogues, and even the color palettes complement one another to portray a very specific kind of fear, something most definitely hard to replicate in live action. The abstract horror that connects the known to the unknown is perhaps where animation works its magic, but almost certainly it can perform more tricks. The limits of abstraction are taken to a strange place in the animated world of Studio Ghibli. I remember watching Spirited Away for the first time and being a bit unsettled by the sight of the mysterious being that is no face. There is no way one could watch Spirited Away and not find how oddly misplaced such a character is in a children's film. honestly, it all works out quite well in the end, even with all the monstrosity in between. But just the first impression of No Face, without context, without knowing anything about him whatsoever, is this the personification of a friendly figure in a children's anime? I'm not quite sure. But I think that's what Miyazaki, and by extension Studio Ghibli, plays with in their style of animation. The edge of the unknown is prevalent in his storytelling, but it remains at a distance. It instills a level of creepiness without even exaggerating, but it always stays locked away in the back of your mind. Even the strange music that accompanies such characters is something to note, but it is fine because it never crosses that bridge between fear and curiosity. And case in point, adding a different background score to an entity like No Face significantly impacts how terrifying such a scene would be. And this would even apply to something whimsical like the cat bus from My Neighbor Totoro. Knowing what you know now, this thing looks hysterical. Its wide eyes, the beaming smile, everything about it is something that makes you chuckle. But the edge of the unknown is played with in a subtle way here. This abstract portrayal could easily slide into the fear of the uncanny with the right background score or a different context. And now that I know what No Face is, the art doesn't creep me out anymore, and that is in a way the power of this medium. The edge of the unknown isn't necessarily a line in the sand. It doesn't have to be a creature under the bed or a haunted house with squeaky floorboards, but rather it can be something so obvious as this, or even this. And based on the artistic designs and the subtleties of context, it can equally invoke fear depending on how you look at it. But once you come down from the boundaries of the imaginary, the fear turns into something more perceptible. But our sensory inputs do have their limits, and this often creates a cognitive dissonance that misleads you. And from this arises a fear that is so human that you may as well play with it in visual forms of storytelling. The uncanny valley is a feeling of uneasiness when non-living things are given human-like features. And on the rare occasion, at least in my mind, this is the cross-section of horror where animation as a medium overpowers even live action, for the uncanny simply has unlimited permutations in the world of the animated. And one such animation that screams Uncanny Valley is the iconic Courage the Cowardly Dog. In one of the first videos that I made on this channel, I talked about why Courage might have just been the scariest cartoon of them all. I guess one of the most hideous examples of the uncanny was portrayed in the musical Cats. I don't think I really have to explain how bad this movie was, but honestly, something that made me uneasy was looking at the faces of these anthropomorphized cats. And I thought about this experiment one night. I imagined that I heard some strange noises coming from under the bed. The first thing that I'll probably do on such an occasion would be to leave the room. But hold on a second, let me see what monster is hiding under the bed. And as I turn around and take a peek through the keyhole, I see one of these cats slowly crawling out from under there. Yeah, I'd probably pick up a baseball bat and go back in to beat the heck out of it. I feel like I would have no hesitation. Uncanny or not, it wouldn't really scare me, I feel. But on a separate occasion, instead of one of these cats, what if a monster from Courage crawled out? Well, I'd probably consider selling my house the next morning. But jokes aside, there was something about the perfection of the uncanny here that is simply unbeatable to this day. Behind every character design, the fundamental intention was to scare us. And one of these characters that I vividly recall that made me extremely uneasy was the character of Freaky Fred. Now, Fred was not exactly a monster, but in fact a relative of Muriel. But from the get-go, he is introduced with minimal dialogue. The lack of emotional range on his face, despite the unsettling toothy grin, simply takes you right into the world of the uncertain. There is not much to go off of other than his recurring utterance of the word
quite naughty.
And it's not that you can't find creepy characters such as this in realistic cinema, but it's the out-of-place nature of characters of the likes of Fred in what is a medium that is largely meant for children that elevates the horror of the uncertain. They could have easily had monsters that are fairly obvious in their features. Sharp canines sticking out of ghastly specters, torn clothes, and razor-sharp claws, and the whole 9 yards. It's more than likely that these characteristics would have scarred my entire childhood, but they chose to be different. And in fact, now that I'm an adult, I see how the medium was just perfect for it. But on the flip side, invoking the uncanny valley can also be completely unintentional. Watching half-baked characters, especially the likes of it in 3D animation, is an exercise in a unique kind of horror that is completely artificial. And the world of animation was riddled with such subjects at the dawn of 3D animation. And I guess you can't blame people for trying, now can you? This was a different time period, and to move the needle forward, whatever had to be done, had to be done. But that doesn't stop people like us from enjoying the absolute creepiness of films like The Polar Express. Who knew motion capturing an entire animated movie would begin in the world of the uncanny? I mean, some of these characters and their movements were straight up weird, to say the least. They move like actual humans, but the animation on top doesn't quite add up. The vacant facial expressions, the motion of the eyeballs, the lack of facial definition. It was a bit weird for the brain to pass off as normality. It had unintentionally created a subcategory of horror that probably vanished with the progression of 3D animation. But the horror of the uncanny can also be a result of the technique implemented for the animation. The world of stop motion had always fascinated me since I was a child. The methodology involved seems to be a daunting task every time you learn about the behind the scenes. For a single minute of animation at the standard frame rate of cinema, you would need to capture about 1,440 individual photos, and not to mention all the pieces of puppetry and claymation that goes into creating the setting for the animation. It sounds spectacularly monotonous. But once you combine these elements, the resulting animation is often considered as halfway between animation and live action. And therefore, for our brains, processing stop motion is a strange exercise. And that illusion would be true for any kind of story in stop motion. But once you add an element of horror to the storyline, it truly messes with your brain. And it is at this conjunction we arrive at Coraline. Before Coraline, I think my knowledge of stop motion mostly revolved around cartoons like Thomas and Friends. Yeah, so imagine my shock when I came across this in stop motion.
You're not my mother.
It is quite deceptive in its appearance. The typical disguised animation, actually aimed at an older audience, is perhaps what I would categorize it as, for the subject matter is a bit dark for the average 7-year-old. But the weirdness of stop motion is indeed what gives life to the horror of Coraline. The animation is pretty stiff and imperfect. Things move in ways that are unnatural to the human eye. In the back of your mind, dolls and puppets are not supposed to do this at all. The way they open their mouths to communicate, the way the joints move around the sockets, none of this is supposed to make sense, but yet here you are watching things as if they were real characters. Imagine watching this as a child. If you thought fear of dolls was a thing, why not try dolls with buttons for eyes? And if you aren't scared of that, there's more. The dolls are eventually gonna entice you into their world to steal your soul. Talk about a great children's story. But seriously, this is how deceptive the horror of animation can be. Things along the uncanny are so prevalent in this medium, but sometimes you forget to be afraid. For after all, in your brain, just as you trained it, it is still just a cartoon, isn't it? But fear is indeed the mind killer. A lot of the things that we are afraid of is practically a feeling that's up in here. And the closer the fear is to your everyday life, feelings of a nature that concerns your existence, rather than the mythical monsters of the unknown, we venture into the psychological side of horror. It is here where fear of the unknown makes the most sense. And if you thought animation wouldn't be the best of mediums to portray this horror, how wrong could you be in thinking that? And I used to be that someone who refused to believe that the complexities of our psyche could manifest as fear while watching something like animation. But I was proven wrong. I was proven wrong emphatically by people like Satoshi Kon. The works of Satoshi Kon are thrilling masterpieces in invoking the horror of the psychological. They alter your perception between the real and the surreal. The visual burns into your mind. The aftermath, a fear of reality that slowly festers upon you. You would think that animation could never do such a thing. After all, the world doesn't look like this, so how could it possibly make you afraid? But this is where Satoshi Kon's storytelling comes in. You fear what you can't understand, but the closer the story takes that fear to your reality, it doesn't matter what medium it is being portrayed in. Psychological fear is unique in how connected it is to your daily life. And amongst all of Satoshi Kon's works, nothing would define this horror better than his debut movie, Perfect Blue. Released in a time when psychological thrillers were the convention, Perfect Blue portrays fear as an entity that surrounds you from every corner. But it's not the monsters under the bed or the deceptive darkness that fulfills this role, but it's actually the fear of the real world, and by extension, the societies evolving right in front of our eyes that makes you question this reality. Mima has no idea of the world that she just walked into, the influence, the fame. It is a burden for the inexperienced mind, and once she realizes her stardom came at the price of her privacy, her mind starts to wander. She questions her reality, and as this fear grows within the protagonist, it emulates the feelings of the audience, because although Mima's world is just a work of fiction, it is immersed in a healthy dose of reality. Stalkers on the internet is not merely an extension of fantasy, it is more real than ever. The amount of privacy violations by prestigious companies would make you wonder if you're being surveillanced by absolute strangers on a regular basis. Fame absolutely makes Mima's life exponentially worse, but how different is the world for even the average person? How different is it now than it was back then? Based on the things that are happening around you, I would be inclined to think, not much. The world is full of twisted realities and sadistic fantasies that mirrors the life of Mima. You never know if you are a pawn in someone's mind games, but watching Perfect Blue makes you wonder. In fact, to frame it precisely, it makes you aware of the dangers of the society. And the fear that arises consequentially is therefore justified as a means for the mind to prepare for the unexpected. But unless you're aware of Satoshi Kon, you would be under the impression that this genre of animated horror hasn't got the minerals to make you afraid. But that would be a strange way to realize that a lot of your favorite surreal fictions and unsettling horrors in live action borrows from the animated world of Satoshi Kon. The fear that ensues is not exactly a result of that translation. It was always there in the back of your mind. But the closest thing that a human can endure in the name of fear is not exactly just related to the psychological. In fact, it is the reality of having a mortal flesh suit that completes the horror of this genre. The fear of having a body is almost universal. To survive is to be mindful of the things that could destroy it. And the fear that arises from this is always pretty intense. Contorted body parts, melting flesh, evolutionary monstrosities. To visualize these things on a screen is to worry about the sanctity of one's body, to learn how frail the human body is compared to what's out there. But in animation, this horror can be pushed to the absolute limits. In the 1988 masterpiece Akira, Tetsuo slowly starts losing control of his body, a fear that grapples with the human mind as we age. The fallibility of the mind and the body is displayed towards the end of the film. As Tetsuo loses control of his powers, at first it takes over the mind, followed by the slow deterioration of his body. And there is a grotesque scene that depicts this in the most visceral way possible. The human flesh can only bear so much, as the weight of his inner powers turns his arm into a monstrosity. A biomechanical hunk of meat and metal, something terrifying for the human mind to even process. In the fascinating sci-fi series Scavenger's Reign, there are creatures that infect the human body in ways that I thought was never possible. Entities using the human body for sustenance is not exactly a new trope, but here the adaptations of the organisms fully utilize the fragility of the unaware body. And it feels like it's the way of nature on this planet. The heart parasite is cunning in its deceptive ways of reproduction. Once they infect you, the body slowly loses agency as the parasite takes control of the host from the inside. From the outside, the body looks healthy and normal, but it is designed to be just that. The infected organism now spits out the seeds of the parasite as far as they travel, perhaps letting this cycle begin all over again. And watching this unfold is a squeamish reminder of the incapabilities of the human body, especially in the wake of alien worlds. But perhaps fittingly, the most disturbing kind of body horror comes from the art of Junji Ito. And despite having covered the cosmic side of his works in the previous section, it would be a travesty to not capture the appalling dread of his contorted designs of human anatomy. In the single episode of Uzumaki where they managed to capture the true essence of the manga, the human body is artistically twisted in ways that I could have never imagined. The unnatural curling of the human tongue, the human body turned into a disturbing spiral, the hypnotic gyre embedded into a girl's forehead. These are just some of the things that are promised to evoke the most instinctive of bodily fear. The art is difficult to even look at, let alone the animation of such monstrosities, but such is the nature of body horror. It is meant to mess with your head. Once you look at a frame such as this, the imagery is imprinted in the brain, seemingly forever, and animated or not, a type of horror that you could only watch once. As I've said at the beginning, it was never my intention to compare the horror of animation to the reality of live action. All I wanted to do was to shed light on a genre that is slept on just because of the perception of the medium. And I think now you can see that if done right, animation can be scary. If you do a bit of searching, there are anime that can keep you up at night. Things that look childish on a superficial level might just offer a different perspective if you give it time to incubate in the mind. And I think what this tells you is the true nature of horror. Fear is a survival tactic. It is as old as life itself. It doesn't have a specific shape or pattern. In fact, it is the fact that we exist that we fear. And the way I see it, animation has no limits to imagination, and by nature, perhaps imagination is where fear dwells the most. And when you put two and two together, just like me, you might just see the absolute horror of animation. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like and maybe consider subscribing as well. And yeah, that's about it, and I'll see you next time.